Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interview series with prominent authors and historians specializing in the colonial period and Revolutionary America. My name is Randy Flood, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Christian DeSpigna, author of Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. Now, this presentation is brought to you in cooperation with the Real American Revolution public television series and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education, both of which will feature this presentation on their YouTube websites. So, Christian, let's introduce our guest.
Thanks, Randy. Dr. Vin Carretta is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Maryland, specializing in transatlantic historical and literary studies during the long 18th century. In addition to more than 100 articles and reviews on a range of 18th century subjects, Vin has published two books on verbal and visual Anglophone political satire between 1660 and 1820, as well as authoritative editions of the works of Kwabna Oduba Kuguano, Philip Kwaku, and other 18th century transatlantic authors of African descent. Vin has also published biographies of Oladua Equianu, Penguin 2007, and Phillis Wheatley, University Press of Georgia 2014. His most recent books are editions of the writings of Ignatius Sancho in 2015, Phillis Wheatley 2019, and Equiano 2020. Vin, welcome to the show. We really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited to talk about Phillis.
Yes, and let me just ask you this, because we know it's always a challenge to write a biography of anyone, but particularly one about an enslaved woman in the 18th century. So can you tell us some of the challenges you encountered in writing Wheatley's life story?
Sure. Let me begin by saying when I first went to the Massachusetts Historical Society to conduct research on her, and they had offered me a fellowship. And when I introduced myself to the director of research, his first question was, "Do you really think you're going to find anything new about Phillis Wheatley?" And I said, "Well, I certainly hope so." Now, the problem with dealing with anyone who's enslaved in the 18th century, or anyone in the 18th century, unless they run into legal problems or have some kind of public identity, it's very difficult to find information about them. And especially a woman, because a woman, if she's, before she's married, if she's living with her parents, her identity is subsumed under that of her father. As soon as she marries, her identity is subsumed under that of her husband.
Right.
Legally. In effect, she doesn't exist legally. So what one has to hope for is to find evidence about either the parents or the husband that would give us information about the subject you're trying to write about. The other problems with Phillis Wheatley is, I think the main reason that no one had tried to write a biography of her for a couple of hundred years was that we assumed that everything we could know about her was already known about her. For example, we didn't know, we had a biography from the 1830s by someone who says that she was a distant relative of Phillis's first female owner, Susanna Wheatley. And she gives us a description of Phillis, and it's a very biased, ultimately it turns out that it's very biased interpretation of Phillis Wheatley. She's particularly hostile about Phillis's husband, John Peters. We always assumed that we couldn't find out anything about John Peters beyond what Odell, who was the first biographer, tells us. And, she tells us he was basically a kind of a bounder and a scoundrel. And that after Phillis's death, he went south, as a lot south of Boston. So people just gave up. I mean, they didn't, try to track him down. And I figured, well, let's see what happens. Fortunately, he ran into lots of legal difficulties, which means that we could track, yes, now we can track him. And I was able to establish where and when he died. It was actually a little north of Boston, not south. So fortunately, when I started out, I pretty much knew what we knew about Phillis. And more importantly, I knew what we didn't know. And that's where every biographer has to start. You have to know where the gaps are, and then try to figure out, okay, can I get to fill them in directly or indirectly through her connections.
Right.
Interesting. Well, Professor, you point out that not that long ago, in the 1960s and 1970s, Wheatley, incredibly, was condemned by African American critics for not denouncing slavery enough. Can you discuss that brief period and how she's kind of come into her own in this Renaissance period of the 21st century?
Yeah, this was during the period of the Black Arts movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Henry Louis Gates has pointed out that the people who criticized her tended to demonstrate that they knew very little about her and what she had written. They'd respond to one or two poems, well, basically one poem, and they didn't consider the context in which she wrote, whether she was writing, what she was writing when she was enslaved versus what she was writing when she was free. Subsequently, we've become much more subtle readers, perceptive readers of Phillis Wheatley's writings and of other people of African descent who are writing, especially when they're enslaved. They have to be very careful about what they say and how they say it. And we're much more sensitive now to how people say what they say. And she is now unchallenged. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, she was accused of demonstrating the Uncle Tom syndrome, of ignoring the evils of slavery, and that she supposedly had, well, she did have a relatively, her enslavement was relatively less onerous than that of the people who were living, suffering, and dying on plantations.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you this. I mean, really incredibly, your biography on Wheatley is the first full-length biography on her in more than 250 years. So can you highlight some of the discoveries that you made about her within your research that you sort of alluded to earlier?
Well, I'll give you one that was based on serendipity, and that is, I'm something of a fanatic, so I was trying to figure out, all right, what was the weather like on any particular day that we can associate with Phillis Wheatley, any significance. And of course, back then they didn't have a meteorological society, they didn't have official weather reports. But what people tended to do was to record the weather in their almanacs, because their almanacs had dates. They had columns and stuff. And so I started to look in Jeremy, why am I blanking?
Belknap's, right?
Sorry for the blank there. Jeremy Belknap's almanac for the year 1773, which came out, of course, the year before that. And I was just trying to find some weather reports, and I discovered, handwritten in the back of it, is his identifying some verses as Phillis's first effort. And he gives an age. And so she was attempting to write poetry as early as around the age of 10 or 11 years old, which we didn't know prior to that. So that's one example of something I discovered. When she goes to London, this wasn't so much a discovery of a fact, but the discovery of the significance, I'd say. When she had gone to London after she returned to Massachusetts in 1773, she wrote to a correspondent in Connecticut and told him that she'd been freed since she returned from London. And she tells him about the people that she had met in London during her 6 weeks there. Now, everyone had gotten all excited about the fact that in this letter, she says she met Benjamin Franklin, who was then representing several northern colonies in London. And I was much more excited to see that she says that her tour guide in London, who took her to the Tower of London, the British Museum, and various other tourist places, many of which are the same tourist places we would go to today, was Granville Sharp. Now, Granville Sharp was the person that the year before, in 1772, had achieved, up to that date, the most significant legal judgment from the Mansfield decision by Lord Mansfield, that no enslaved person brought to Britain from the colonies could legally be returned to the colonies as a slave, could be forcibly returned to the colonies. And so here's her tour guide. And from Granville Sharp's perspective, he had been working on for the previous 10 years, trying to get legal decisions affecting slavery. And here he's with, by that point, she is the most celebrated person of African descent in the British Empire. And a few weeks after their meeting, she's telling her correspondent that she's been freed, and she says, at the desire of her friends in England. So I argued, and it's an argument that I think is now universally accepted, that what Phillis and Granville Sharp would have talked about, it's inconceivable that they wouldn't have talked about our opportunity to basically manumit herself, that she said to her owners or to the captain of the ship that they owned that she wasn't going to return unless she was guaranteed that she would be freed if she did so. So, it was one of the examples of several that I found that demonstrate the agency she had, even as an enslaved person, the control she had over her own life, which especially in the Black Lives, the Black Arts Movement period, the assumption was that she was a very passive figure. Things just happened to her. And one of the things I discovered is that no, things didn't just happen to her. She made things happen for her. And another thing that I discovered was a lot about John Peters, and the possible explanation, or I think a probable explanation for one of the big gaps in her life, and that is a 3-year gap from the 1780, 1784, the early period of 84. And she just disappears from the records, and I think it's because of John Peters. And we could talk about that if you want.
Yeah. Give us just a little background on that, if you would, about what happens in those 3 years. I mean, if you.
All right. Well, let me lead up to that a little bit, because
yeah, sure.
She returned to Boston. She is freed. She continues to live with the Wheatleys. Susanna Wheatley, her mistress, dies in 1774, early 1774. Phillis apparently continues to live with John Wheatley, her owner, a previous owner at that point, until his death in the middle of March of 1778. Then on April 1st, 1778, she and John Peters announced their engagement. Now, previously, people assumed this is when she and John Peters married, because she shortly thereafter moves in with John Peters, or is living at his address. But they didn't marry until Thanksgiving Day of 1778. John Peters, we know a lot about because he was very litigious. So he was in and out of courts a lot. He was suing a lot of people. Now, this was pretty common in the 18th century. This is how you try to collect debts. But he was a retail merchant primarily at this point, and he was doing pretty well. I found where he was living and his property taxes, his tax records, etc. So, I could compare his income to that of others around him. And in 1778, 1779, he's doing quite well. In late 1779, Phillis advertises for a second volume of poetry, trying to find subscribers so she could publish a second volume. And in 1778, suddenly they disappear. Well, I think the explanation is the fact that while he was collecting some debts that were owed to him, he's sued by a woman who is a wholesale grocer who apparently is supplying him with the groceries and the products that he's selling in Western Massachusetts. She's suing him for an amount that's much greater than his assessed value according to the property records, something he couldn't possibly pay back. And we even have the records of when he's called to court several times in the suit that she brings against him. It's clear he's losing the suit. Suddenly they disappear. Now, in the 18th century, the only way, if you're being sued for debt, if you're losing a suit for debt, you have really only a couple choices, or I guess 3 choices. You can go to jail for debt, not a desirable choice. You can hide in your house and never come out until your creditor gives up, or you can sneak away in the middle of the night and go undercover. Well, he went, I think what they did is they went undercover. They did it really well because you can't find any record of him, and thus of Phillis. And they don't pop up again until the end of the war, where suddenly he comes back. They're back in Boston. He's advertising he applies for a license to sell liquor, alcohol, at a grocery shop. He's almost immediately arrested for debt and sent to jail for debt. His main creditor, the woman who was his main creditor, was still in Boston. I'm sure as soon as she saw his name pop up, she went after him. He was probably almost certainly in jail for debt when Phillis died in December. Now, we don't have monthly records of who's in jail, but they did have quarterly records. And in September of 1784, he's in jail for debt.
Right. Well, I wanted to backtrack a little bit because this is important about and Randy, maybe you could talk about this for the next question.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something. I was just thinking about the education. Let's talk about her education a little bit. I find it incredibly astonishing that she gains almost international fame, you might say, as a poet at a very, very young age. And yet, she was reading adult literature like Alexander Pope and Homer at a very young age. Her owner John Wheatley was a tailor, and he certainly wasn't in the upper echelons of Boston society to provide money for her education. So, and the family physician, we understand, of course, was Dr. Joseph Warren for a brief period. But can you talk to us and kind of give us an insight about her education? Because it's very, very unusual for a female in particular, let alone an enslaved person, to obtain an education at that particular point in time. Can you talk a little bit about her education and how she acquired that?
Sure. um, Now we don't have a full account of how she was, why she was educated, but I think it's pretty clear that they recognized very early on that she was a child prodigy.
Mm-hmm.
And she's living with an evangelicals, especially Susanna Wheatley, who was an evangelical Christian, who's linked to the transatlantic evangelical community, which is part of what enables Phillis to be able to publish a book and to acquire the Countess of Huntingdon as a patron. But they quickly recognized her abilities. Though he was a tailor, among other things, he was also a merchant and a transatlantic merchant. At this time, most people had multiple occupations in case one failed. I mean, John Peters, for example, identified himself as a physician, a lawyer, a pintle smith maker, a gentleman, none of which required a formal education, or for a person of African descent, you couldn't have a formal education, become a lawyer or a physician. But the Wheatleys had every indication we have is they had social ambitions. But as evangelicals, they were responsible for the religious education of everyone in their household, which include any person who was enslaved. So, and that religious education for an evangelical meant access to the Bible. So they would have naturally promoted her learning to read, at least, so that she could read the Bible. Also, the better she did, the better it looked for them.
Right.
Both as her religious mentors, her masters, her owners. It's sort of like having suddenly discovering, wow, I could buy a BMW and park it in my driveway rather than my old Pinto. So, the better she looked, the better they looked. And I think as soon as they realized, oh, wow, she is a really quick study. And this is going to redound to our, status, because she's always identified as belonging to them. And I think that's a large part of, once they gave her the access to reading, which meant access to the Bible, and she just took off, and they figured, whoa, in effect, they could, hook themselves to her rising star.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because I was really curious about this, because she gains her freedom over in London, and do you think if she stayed there, she would have attained a higher level of success? Why do you think she chose to return to Boston?
Well, I don't think there's much doubt that she would have attained a higher level of success, or maintained a high level of success, because even after she left London, there were a number of publications in London that linked her with other prominent women authors. What's fascinating to me is the sort of several degrees of separation. Now, some of the women authors that she was associated with or likened to were women who were close friends of Samuel Johnson, the great Samuel Johnson, who was very anti-slavery. So she would probably have gotten into those circles. She would also probably, almost certainly, gotten into the circles of British evangelicals. I mean, she was already connected to them, but John Newton is writing about her. So she, I would say she, from her perspective, she probably should have stayed in London.
Right.
But well, why did she choose not to? Well, 1773, they've just had this ruling in the Mansfield decision, right. 1772. It was looking as if there were lots of reasons why people could believe that slavery in North America was probably going to end. There was a good chance of it ending. There was all these, remember, we're on the cusp of the American Revolution, so you're having lots of arguments about natural rights and freedom from oppression, et cetera, et cetera. She is guaranteed a freedom if she goes back. She had the Wheatleys were as close to a family as she was going to have. The letter that she writes to another person of African descent when Susanna Wheatley died indicates that Phillis, felt a familial relationship with Susanna Wheatley. So she had personal and political reasons that I think it was basically a rolling of the dice. And I think she just decided, okay, I'll take the chance.
Right.
Going back. But she was really smart because in this letter that she wrote to her correspondent in Connecticut, David Wooster, after she talks about her being a tourist in London, and she sounds starry-eyed and she uses a passive voice, this happened to me, they showed me this, they brought me here. Suddenly, the moment she mentions having been freed, her voice shifts to the active voice, and she tells Wooster, by the way, I've sent a copy of my manumission papers to a representative of the colonies in London so that my property, present and future, she's already anticipating making money as an independent woman, will be guaranteed from my former owner and his heirs. And she also says, and I've made sure that to protect myself from pirated copies, unauthorized copies of my book, I've autographed all of the authentic copies so I get my profits. So she goes from, in the same letter, from a sort of story, I remember she's about maybe 19, she's a teenager,
right.
From being the starry-eyed tourist, in the same letter, suddenly shifting, I'm a savvy businesswoman. I already read, now I'm on my own. As she says, she uses the phrase, now I'm on my own footing in this letter. And okay, so this is a very different Phillis Wheatley from the Phillis Wheatley of that Black arts movement.
Well, let's talk about the end of her life, which is very tragic, dying in abject poverty and abandoned by her husband. Could you enlighten us a little bit about how her life ended?
Well, we don't know a lot about the ending of her life. For example, we don't know where she's buried. I'm not sure I ascribe to the notion that she was abandoned by her husband. If he was in jail for debt, I don't consider that a voluntary decision. The notion that she was abandoned by her husband comes from Odell, that 19th century biography. And for Odell's picture of John Peters, he's a kind of snidely whiplash He's an uppity black man who has pretensions to social status above his, where he should be. This comes across very directly in Odell. And Odell's image of Phillis Wheatley's life was that Phillis Wheatley was never happier or more content than when she was living as a slave in the Wheatley household. That they took care of her. She had no worries. She had room and board. She had security. Then when she marries this bounder, John Peters, he's pretentious. And she's the one who says that he abandoned her and that, she died with the last of the 3 children in her arms, etc. We have no evidence that they had children. I mean, they may have, but I haven't found any baptismal or burial records of any children of them. So the idea that he abandoned her really comes from Odell. She apparently just before, a few months before she died, she did advertise again for a second volume of her poetry writings. She had, in the first time that she had advertised back in 1779, she advertised under a married name, which meant that anyone familiar with Phillis Wheatley wouldn't have made the connection that this was a bad marketing decision, which I think probably her husband was responsible for. But once he's in jail in September of 1784, she advertises under her, she says, she gives her married name and she says, formerly Phillis Wheatley. So she makes sure that the readers would know that she was that Phillis.
Well, let's just wrap it up with this. I know there's a lot of controversy today as far as statues, but what about Phillis Wheatley's legacy today in terms of memorials? We know there's a plaque dedicated to her in Boston's Chinatown area regarding where she had first arrived, but are there any other statues or memorials dedicated to Wheatley?
Yes, sir. There's a really nice one on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston that was erected in 2003 as part of the Boston Women's Memorial. It includes statues of Abigail Adams and Lucy Stone. There's a plaque commemorating her in London at the site of the office of her publisher in London. There are a number of, there's the Wheatley Hall at UMass Boston. There's the Phillis Wheatley YMCA in Washington, D.C. There are high schools and elementary schools named after her in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina. There was a play, are we sticking with material?
No, just enlighten us.
Whatever. Yeah.
Pardon?
Tell us, enlighten us. No, we're not just sticking to that.
There was a play performed in London in 2018 called Phillis in London. That play was written by Ade Solanke. There, just a few months ago, in 2020, there was a collection of poems by Honoré Fanon Jeffers called The Age of Phillis, which is a fictional poetic biography of Phillis that tries to fill in the gaps, using imagination to fill in the gaps in Phillis's life. So the answer is yes. There's a lots of memorialization of her now.
Yeah, and we think you did an incredible job with the biography and recommend it to people to pick it up and read it. And we really want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. and we appreciate your time.
Well,
So
thank
to
you.
our listeners, we've been talking with author Vin Carretta. Join us next time, and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. On behalf of my colleague, Randy Flood, and myself, this is Christian Despina saying so long for now. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vin. Appreciate it.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks for taking time.
Bye.